talking about food systems. My name is Julian Isaacs. I'm actually retired, but I am the chair of the Agricultural Research Council for my sins. And so your conversations around food systems research resonates because we're an agricultural research council. And so the focus of what we're talking, I'm hoping to take into the research agenda of the Agricultural Research Council. I'm going to leave that as an introduction. If you're interested, I've done many, many interesting things, but I think for time, we need to move straight into it. So I have prepared colleagues, because we're all colleagues, after all, we all eat. Just a couple of notes that I've picked up and I thought we should focus on, because this session also deals with the current situation. It is fine to say we need to go into transitions, but we need to recognize both legacies, history, and current practices. Otherwise, we cannot transition into something that the future needs. So just a couple of introductory notes to all of you. And that is, globally, the agricultural production and value chain needs a reset. I don't think there's any argument as we listen to each other, as we talk to colleagues, it has to be reset. Now, what is ironic is that when we look at the growth of agriculture globally, it was based on food security to change agricultural production patterns. But it changed to high intensive. It's high inputs, hybrid seeds, and it's absolutely commercial with no sense of an individual anywhere near it. But there was no respect for the environment nor for the future generations. We have climate change here and now. It's not something that's going to happen. The resources we take for granted are under pressure. Water, arable soils, climate. And additional to that is consumer demands that are changing. People want us to be transparent of what we produce, how we produce. And they want to trace it. They want to know who has produced it, not just in the supermarket. And given these just 3 points, you will agree with me, transitions are required. So agro-ecological production systems must be introduced. And Professor May this morning gave us the levels. But the transitions must happen sooner than later. But in order to do that, we must understand the fault lines in the agricultural production and value chain systems. We need to understand the impact of climate change and the solutions required to transition not only to mitigate climate change, but into agro-ecological practices. I would say it's a double whammy. We need to understand consumer demands, and it's about food security, food safety, and nutrition. And those are non-negotiable. So where do we start? I think the FSNet-Africa is a good place because we're starting to communicate with each other. We have to do research which was confirmed this morning, but we also have to do extension of those messages. Because nothing is more depressing when people talk about research, when they actually communicate, but they're not communicating with those people that need it. Partnerships, it's like, duh, of course, because none of us can do it on our own. But I think there's something I want to actually emphasize, and that is the farmer must be central. When we talk about food systems, we need to start with that person producing as the central figure. Because who do we do it for? Both the consumer, yes, but also for the farmer. I'm going to be very controversial by quoting Henry Ford about teamwork. He says, coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first session, and we have an amazing array of beautiful women that's going to share their story, their research, their understanding with us around food systems. So I would like to invite Anne, and I think we saw her earlier at the start, to do. She has 15 minutes, and then we're going to move on to the next immediately. And in fact, have the questions after the 4 presentations. So don't forget our social media, the hashtags for you making comments, and keep the questions coming so that we can get some real conversations going. Thank you, and very welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, and thank you for that lovely welcome. It's lovely to be part of an array of beautiful women. It's great not to be part of a manel, as they often say. So my name's Anne Talentire. I'm at the University of Leeds, and I've been invited to talk about past research that relates to sustainable food systems and the contribution that agroecology might play. And as you might guess from the title of my presentation, and my academic title as Professor of Sustainability and Business, I don't work directly on agroecology, but I've worked in interdisciplinary teams concerned with food and agriculture for about 25 years now, often with a focus on food grown but not always consumed in sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps I'm looking at some of these legacies and current practices and thinking of some of the fault lines that you've just identified, and trying to understand what's wrong with some of our current systems. So over the years, I've come to characterize my work as focusing on supply chains, but that's not necessarily how I started out. I described my PhD about being about trading relationships, and I think that's a key word for me. It's that relational element. And I've always been very much interested in the links between people and organizations as the commodities or products that they might exchange, and as Julian maybe mentioned before, also institutions and how we think and the rules of the game that are very important. So next slide, please. So the slide here just highlights a number of projects that I've been involved with and I'm trying to focus on. So a lot of focusing on trade in food originally on the sort of social conditions for workers and smallholders, and increasingly added in more environmental dimensions of sustainability, bringing in more ecological ideas like resilience. And I've also had some projects about relationships between researchers, and some of those researchers being in farmers' organisations. So I'm very interested to hear in the first session about the importance of partnership. And so the latter part of my talk will be about some of the relationships I've had with other researchers and projects about that. But on to the broader focus of my work, as I say, is increasingly become about supply chains. So sorry, the next slide, please. And my focus, my sort of the question that I've been grappling with or interested in is how supply chains can become more sustainable, and if, or how, and then if trade can develop to deliver sustainable development. And a lot of the work I've done in the past has been about sustainability standards, particularly in global chains, thinking about the idea of fair trade. Yes, about standards, but also about the companies or organizations that were involved in those trading relationships. and increasingly being interested about if supply chains are going to become more sustainable, where is the voice of the producer or the farmer, which is something that Joyanne mentioned about the farmer need to be central, but also the worker. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So following on from the first session, and as Julian mentioned, the 5 levels of transition towards sustainable food systems, hopefully from that introduction, from my introduction, I hope that you can see that my talk will probably talk about ideas around level 5 and level 4 of this framework, around global connections, and what's our vision for trade and trading relationships. And particularly thinking about the principles that I've circled in here, particularly about connectivity and how we connect, and the co-creation of knowledge. And I'll pick up a little bit, well, a theme running through a lot of my work has also been about fairness. I started work on fair trade, but also how we encourage participation of different stakeholders. So next slide, please. So yeah, could you click? Yeah, so, and then the next one, that's it. So in the briefing notes I was given that provides the background for this workshop, there was the quote that really inspired me, made me start thinking about what I should talk about, is this quote here about the food system being characterized by different perspectives that are often opposed, and perhaps there's sometimes suspicion and conflict because we don't always know about what's in those silos of different disciplines that Alice mentioned earlier. And as we mentioned, that there's a hope that we can start thinking about being more transparent. So as the title of my presentation suggests, as put at the top of this slide here, I think some of those areas of suspicion and misunderstanding or even conflict is the idea of supply chains, and as one way in which the food systems connect. Obviously, supply chains are very different from food systems, but it's often a concept that's sort of put in within food systems thinking. And the idea of a supply chain is deceptively simple, as I've just put in this this diagram here, with the links in the nodes between the supplier and the consumer, supplier or producer and the consumer. But supply chains can be very, very complex with many, many nodes. And even when they're simple and direct, they are sites of bargaining and inevitably power relations. The way people often talk about supply chains often occludes or hides the power relations that are at play, and how they are represented diagrammatically often makes power and inequality seem invisible. So here we've got these 3 ovals, whereas some of those nodes might be one large organisation, so a manufacturer or a trader with a big concentration of power, and other actors may be small and just dispersed with far fewer resources and power, and particularly less bargaining power. But this is often how we see supply chains presented in this simple way. You know, to the next slide, please. So different disciplines that considered supply chains try to represent the aspects that are important to them. So beyond those sort of linking the different nodes. So this diagram here comes from transport logistics, with a focus on the challenges of the first mile, trying to get product to market from scattered smallholders, here in a so-called modern export chain. To move to the next supply chain, as next slide. So in this next slide, we've got another representation of French beans coming from Kenya to the UK supermarkets. But this one, as a different depiction, focuses much more on the coordination of those nodes, or those the blue shapes. And this is typical of a global value chain approach, where it's highlighting the way trading relations are enacted between the nodes. So we've got some of them are market relations, which are by the thin arrows, where the focus is on price and volume, and it's all about buyers and sellers may be different for each transaction. And at the other end of the hierarchy, there's vertical integration between nodes, and in this case, large exporters who are owning the plantations. And between large importers and large exporters are the links that are considered relational, which are close and regular ties between each node. So these might be between strategic partners. And then there might be another type of relationship which is often characterised as modular. And I could get into these details, and people do, in a long and detailed way, but I don't want to do that. But I wanted to show these two diagrams, as whilst they show very similar information and use similar language, what they focus on is very different. Just showing two examples here. And we can see the supply chains or value chains are considered quite differently, as we see in the next slide, which is another complicated diagram. But just showing you here in this one about how discussions about supply chains in a development context are very, very different. Also come from different disciplines. And often discussions about supply chains in the development context start with the very practical questions that Alice and Joanne have talked about value addition and market access or inclusion, which I've put as the top right of this conceptual map. But there are many more conceptions of supply chains and how they operate and for whom, which is an important piece. Supply chain management from business thinking, which is in the top half I've highlighted in green, comes from business thinking, may be perceived as demand-led and linked to the market. But the literature here tends to be focused on the needs of the focal company and the management of upstream operations. So we're talking about the retailers, the buyers, and getting to the consumer. The producer sometimes is in this literature, but very little the farmer. The bottom half of the diagram starts to map out some more analytical or critical perspectives that seek to understand what's going on beneath the surface. And my own works move back and forward between the practical supply orientation in the top right-hand corner to different combinations of analytical perspectives on the bottom half. I don't seek to give a lecture on the many approaches to supply chains, but I wanted to highlight the many lenses that we can use to consider connectivity between supply chain actors. Some more focused on chains and vertical relations between nodes, and others that consider a wider range of actors that might influence trading relations and how they're shaped. So the systems of provision idea or global production networks, which come more from political economy. And we also might highlight that these tend to explore what exists rather than posit how producers and consumers should be connected. So this is the sort of the critique of the past and the present. And often this literature isn't perhaps enough thinking about what should be in the future. Should we move to the next slide, please? So I think it's important to highlight that supply chains are constructs rooted in a material reality, so linked to the characteristics of a particular product, whether they're perishable or not, and its geography, and importantly, who produces them. But these supply chains are experienced, perceived in diverse ways, but also have different kinds of impact. So the bullets I've put on this slide, I don't intend to go through those in detail, but these are just some of the ways in which power relations within supply chains have been examined in my own work, including with PhD students. So the next slide, please. So given the topic of this workshop and the concerns of the analytical framing, the 5 levels of transition to sustainable food systems, I just wanted to highlight a paper I wrote with Valerie Nelson on the ideational power at work in the shaping of standards. And it's on the list of references at the end. And it's about how standards or sustainability standards have been produced, presented as a response to sustainability and equity concerns in various value chains. And we can see power at work in the development and uptake of standards. So powerful retailers may require suppliers to meet a particular standard before buying from them in a very top-down articulation of power. Talking about protecting the buyer or the retailer from risk, and what we call the global sourcing narrative. But even in narratives that were more about development, for example, ensuring that workers and smallholders could benefit from the application of standards, there's not very much questioning about how they're shaped and how they impact on the capacities of the producer. And often they're very much focused on the sites of production in a top-down way and don't think about the wider landscape, whether it's ecological landscape or regulatory landscape in which production takes place. And it's only when we get to what we call the potentially transformative narratives that questions are asked about the instruments that are chosen to manage the supply chain and what may bring benefits to workers. So we're emphasising the role of organisations representing and articulating the voice of smallholders and workers in questioning both the structure and the tools that are used within the value chain. So we argue that developmental narratives have got very closely aligned to the powerful global sourcing narrative and might get locked in to a particular path and might miss opportunities for transformation. So you move on to the next slide. I wanted to think about that unpacking of different narratives led me to think about moving away from working on value chains to working with key actors in the value chain. So the work from working on and about to working with. And so two projects that I just want to flag up as I come towards the end of my talk. I've been very interested in how knowledge is created or co-created within value chains. So working with key actors, and the slide on the left represents working with Fair Trade International, a standard setting organisation that's starting to think about how they work with researchers to generate impact for small producers. So that was very much about the sort of Fair Trade as an NGO working with academics and understanding the different worlds in which we operate and how we can work together to articulate the voice of smallholders or to improve the benefits to smallholders. And the slide on the right is about a project I had funded from the Arts and Humanities Research Council about articulating farmer perspectives, where we partnered with universities in Tanzania and Ghana, but also farmer organisations as key partners in some training that we undertook for early career researchers to have more critical perspectives on how food systems work, so they could better articulate the needs of farmers through their research in partnership with the farmer organisations. So,
and to start closing, please.
I am one slide left. So, okay. So they're very interested in co-creation knowledge, and we can say lots of things about what the successes are built on, but we also need to, I think it's important to try. So we just move to the next slide, where it's called co-creation of knowledge. Again, that's it. Also want to think it's important to recognise some of the challenges and frustrations, that this work is not easy. And the pandemic has brought us together in lots of ways of using technology in different ways, but it's also created and reinforced some of the inequalities. I think we need to acknowledge that, as well as the strides we've made in some ways of bringing partners together in share with when we've got empathy and really focusing on shared goals and relationship building. So then that's the last slide, concluding thoughts. Sorry, I had two more. So I just wanted to say, hopefully I've talked about the importance of connectivity and criticising and critiquing carefully about how we, what are the nature of the connections. I think it's important that we interrogate how we describe and understand those connections, particularly in a supply chain context, and understand those different starting points when we're thinking about knowledge, importance of multiple perspectives. And I shouldn't stop. I need to emphasize the importance of power relations, which I think is a thread running through my work and my contribution for today. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for going over.
Thank you very much, Anne. I would like Stella to please join and share with us her presentation.
Good afternoon. I am one of the beautiful ladies that she mentioned. Yeah, so very happy to be part of this discourse on agroecology transitions in Africa. And I will be using my research in food systems as examples in my presentation. And first to mention that FSNet-Africa model is a very good model that brings together scientists and what I would call non-academic actors in co-creation and sharing of knowledge that impacts on society. And agroecology depends very much on networks, be it consumer networks or farmer networks. Agroecology is also very knowledge intensive. And this knowledge is not only with the scientists, the knowledge is also with the indigenous communities and farmers. And therefore it's important for us to also think about intergenerational transfer of knowledge as we think about agroecology. So networks, intergenerational transfer of knowledge is very important. So our food systems are in crisis, from food insecurity to poverty and inequality. And in Africa, we have serious problems of poverty as well, and poverty in rural areas. So smallholder farmers feed the world, but are among the poorest. And there are a lot of inequalities that exist, within rural areas, as well as even in urban areas. So our food systems are also contributing to a lot of environmental degradation, and they are not realizing the right to food. And therefore we have to think about, agroecology, because agroecology is more holistic, integrating both social and ecological approaches in order to produce food that is more, nutritious. And if you ask me, if we converted all the monocultures into agroecological systems, we would be able to produce more healthy and nutritious food as compared to what we are doing now. So agroecology is a system that builds climate resilience. And that our food systems are producing a lot of emissions from nitrous oxide to methane. And therefore, if we want to move towards a more environmentally friendly production, and then we need to think about agroecology. So this transition must be gradual. Of course, we already have a lot of pockets of agroecology in Africa, but there is need to, enhance. And we must also be able to capture power relations, encourage a lot of participation, especially science that is that enables, communities also to participate in the research that we do. In one of the research that I have been involved in, we analyzed 27 research projects that are funded by Swiss National Science Foundation, and we discovered that the impact on science is very high, the impact on policy is very small, and the impact on practice is a little, bigger. And one of the questions we were asking, so why is it that your research does not, impact on policy? And they said, it's because we don't involve non-academic actors from the beginning of the research. And if you do that, then your research can be able to impact more. We need agroecology also to reduce or eliminate some of the challenges that we have, like gender inequality. Our production is not so responsible, climate change, as she mentioned, and also increase biodiversity. But there are many principles that we can use. Even within monocultures, you can have some buffer zones of vegetation so that this vegetation can buffer the agro ecosystems. And smallholder farmers are also very diverse, and therefore they provide a lot of agro-ecosystem services. But we need also to promote a lot of participation within our communities, where even in urban areas we can share the knowledge that we have on the foods, healthy foods. Because the young people now are eating a lot of, they like the chips and, chicken. But then we have a lot of knowledge with our mothers and our grandfathers that we can share also with the young people. So participation is very important, and also building healthy soils. So we need to think about healthy soils, and the seeds, I think, come second. Because in Kenya, we have a big debate on GMO. And one of the argument is, do we need healthy soils or do we need seeds like GMO? There are several agroecology practices, and we have seen that crop rotation, for example, if introduced in monocultures, can improve a lot the production systems. The use of green manure, organic agriculture, and shifting towards biopesticides also worked very well. And we need to support the movements, the social movements that exist in Africa, because these social movements also create agro-entrepreneurs. They are very important in advocacy and capacity building, and also campaigning for the rights of the vulnerable people. Some of the examples include learning from the resilience and robustness of smallholder farms, but I have to mention that not all smallholder farmers are resilient, because there's a lot of also use of chemicals. And you need also a lot of structural changes. We need to restore diversity in large-scale monocultures, empower our women, and promote also farmer-to-farmer sharing. And we also need technology innovation that is appropriate, that does not, destroy our environment. And we need to co-create knowledge together with the people that use that knowledge. And in summary, agroecology transition in Africa will require a lot of changes in production systems. It will require socio-economic relations. For example, building circular and solidarity economies where producers are connected with consumers to be able also to develop local levels. And we need institutions that are responsive. We need the political will, but we need change of mindset. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. I can't believe it. Can you? Can I ask you, I would like the farmer to have the last word, if you don't mind. Can I just say, well done, actually saving us time. And I thoroughly enjoyed your speech. It adds to our body of knowledge. And I really appreciate it. So, I'm now going to introduce the next speaker, another beautiful woman, but there's a proviso. She's also a plant pathologist like me. So we have a shared bond beyond the food systems research. So Lisa, we would like to hear from you and welcome to address us.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's lovely to be here in time, and I'm proudly a plant pathologist. But it's also about people, profit, and planet. So the 3 Ps, very importantly. I'm just going to go back to agroecology and from a historic point of view, and then I'm going to end my talk with research that we are currently doing. So yes, in this case, the scientists will have the last word, and I'm going to reflect on the past, not the last word, but okay. I'm going to give you a scientific perspective. Let's just move back to the definition, yes, there's many, and if we look at the FAO Knowledge Hub, the more holistic approach, the ecology, the social, the design and management, these are key words that actually phrase this concept for us. But if we look back at where it started, which according to records 1929, and that was actually a person working on corn varieties. And if we look at how that discipline or field of study developed, and we can see particularly in the 60s, 70s and 80s, it really became a global adopted concept. And if I just look at the publications over the last, say, 38 years, we can see that the big impact has been the last 10 years. Now, I'm talking about roughly, if we look at Web of Science, almost 700 publications, which if I compare that with food security, and I look at just the last 23 years, we are already talking almost 8,500 publications. So this is very important to understand the trends, because at what stage do we get technologies being adopted by scientists and that we see the expression of their outcomes, of their results in papers, and how long does it take from that point where we actually get implementation and the impact on policies and governance. So I can also draw another interesting parallel for you, and I've taken food sovereignty. And if I look at food sovereignty, it's really in the last 12 years that this has really started making an impact. And we can see the publication trend. We are talking about 500 publications, which if we compare that with agroecology, it is clear that it is scientifically unexplored fields, and we should see a significant impact, and particularly if we look at food sovereignty and the current situation in Ukraine. So it'll be very interesting to see the trends. We can further analyze the publication trends, but it's also often driven by funding incentives. So let's just, as a reminder, touch on food sovereignty. As you all know, it's been adopted, and I think the last was the World Food Summit. And it's really about that ability of states and people to exercise their right to define and freely implement the policies. So yes, we are still at the stage of talking about policies, of talking about science should be implemented and guiding policies. And it's really about that right to food, the right of people to govern and control that food supplies. And now more than ever before, we are reminded of the vulnerability of people and of nations, and how sovereign are we really in the global context. So this, to me, is really an important and emerging field. But let me go back to agroecology, which really, if we look at the big launch in 2018 at the International Symposium of Agroecology, that's where we really saw that the FAO adopted this. And we see that the tool for agroecology performance evaluation, TAPE, was really established. It had its impact, and we can see the implementation as part of the FAO's vision. So now we have a concerted effort, a global interest and drive. And very interestingly also, if we, for instance, look at agroecology Lex, which is, of course, that specialized database, and the differentiation and the establishment of these legal frameworks, policies, and programs. So I just want to touch quickly on the 13 principles. It started with 10 principles, and if you look at some of the literature, you find 13, and the different levels of transition. Now, if we look at the and the transformative phases of the food system, the synergies, and perhaps one can better unpack it for you by looking at 3 levels. And I'm really talking about the 3 categories. So if we look at the first category, A in this case, which is really your basis for your basic establishment of your principles. And this is where the original focus, and I'm talking about 1970s, 1980s, where the agricultural environment was predominantly dictating that discipline. And then we had the impact of social cultural, which was around the 1990s and 20s, when we heard the voice of the broader and the social community. And then, of course, the economic, and then finally the political dimensions that really was playing a fundamental role in establishing these basic principles. If we look at the scales of adaptation, and then you can look at the pilot field scales, which was from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, to the farm agro-ecosystem scales, to now in the 20s, the food system scales. So disciplines will always be in transition. And I can take it back to plant pathology, which is also a discipline in transition. And it will always migrate. And it will always form part of the bigger picture. And if we look at the last scale, the manifestations, and that's where you really get the adoption at different levels. And it's quite important to keep this in mind when we develop our food systems policy. So let's just quickly look at the current 10 FAO portals, because there's a lot of parallels with other disciplines. And at the end, I want to take it through to food safety and One Health. So first of all, efficiency. The efficient, innovative practices. Secondly, balance, and we talk a lot about resilience of people and systems and communities. Thirdly, we talk about diversity, and linking that diversity to nutrition and security. And fourthly, which I think is key, is really that co-creation and sharing of knowledge. And this sort of openness, sharing of information, opening up systems, transparency is very prominent in all disciplines at this stage. And then, of course, recycling, and this is very important to reduce the impact on your environment and, of course, your economic impact. And we know that the 6th one, the synergies between the food systems and the multiple ecosystem services. We then move on 7 as your human and social values, protecting that rural livelihoods, equity, extremely important, and social well-being. And then, of course, very popular and very important now, the circular economy, circular and solidarity, looking at planetary boundaries, and then finally, the last 2, cultural and food traditions, and land and natural resources. So it's extremely important that we look at how these dimensions have been adopted in other fields. If we just look at in the USA with sustainable agriculture and the Food and Agricultural Environmental Trade Act of 1990, and how that has been adopted. And if we look at the implementation of this in other disciplines, the centers of environmental farming systems, the organic industry, and here we're looking specifically at biodiversity, how we use microbiomes, for instance, to better understand our soils, to better manipulate our soils, to restore that natural ecological balance. And then social justice, and very important connection for us. It's about that resilience and the Feed the Future programs, the USA EU Green Deal, and then finally looking at a fit for purpose, how that fits into the whole fruit production, the gender, the social dimensions around gender, social culture, tradition, and the economic income, trade, marketing principles. I want to just mention finally, I still have a minute or two, in terms of the SDG tools, how we can use these simulation models and how we can predict by 2030, and this is just elements that I've pulled out, how SDG 2, 11, 13, and 15 could perform and almost double in terms of achieving those SDGs. So extremely important to look at these agroecology scenarios and to also finally look at just what's happening in the South African space. And I just want to reference a study by Stephen Greenberg and Scott Tremini about identifying the need for a regulatory framework to govern this sector and to increase compliance and transparency, traceability and accountability, and to ensure high quality production. And I want to add safe food, whether it's in the formal sector or the informal sector. We need to adapt, transform, and we need to also look at other studies such as BioWatch, the Food Lab, and I want to end with FSNet, Arua, and the Center of Excellence, where we have actually generated a lot of information that's now feeding into this, and we hope that the DSI Food Security Knowledge Platform will enable us to unpack these tools. The last slide is about where does food safety fit into this, into the inclusive One Health, into reducing food waste and losses, to address the right to food and clean water, and finally, how we play an important role in governance, policy, legislation, and regulations. I think my time is up, and I just want to map how we unpack the food control system and what an extremely important role science plays in guiding policy and governance. And with that, for the One Food concept, which to me is the future pathway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We will keep you here. Is this your spectacles? I don't want you not to see. Yeah, or make a spectacle. Ladies and gentlemen, the last of the beautiful woman that I promised you, but actually not just a beautiful woman, a farmer. Ladies and gentlemen, there is space for all of us in agriculture, whether it's old or young. And Vutlari has just given us the real deal. So I would like to invite her to share with us her presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
A warm afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure when you were told there's a farmer coming to present, you probably expected a man with khakis, or maybe an older woman, you know, he's been in the industry for such a long time. But actually, this is a new face of agriculture. There are young people who have seen the opportunities in agriculture, who are willing to make a success out of it, but it's a really challenging industry. So I'm quite excited to be here to be sharing on some of the agroecological practices that we've tried to implement in our organization. I have to confess, before I received the invitation, I had never even heard of the word agroecological practices. So it's been quite exciting to sit among the researchers and actually quite understand that there's so much value that we can draw from the academia side to help us manage our operations on a day-to-day basis. A bit background about who we are. So I've always wanted to be in business. And I knew that at some point in my career, I want to go into entrepreneurship. And when the time had come, I started looking at different industries. And there's this blog, How We Made It in Africa, is one of my favorite ones. And I was doing my research, I realized that a lot of young people in other African countries were making really successful careers in agriculture. I started researching in the South African context, and I realized, oh my God, there are actually opportunities for black females in the agricultural space. The one challenge that I had at the time was that I did not have access to land. My family does not have any agricultural land, so the only way for me to enter the industry was through leasing, because I knew there wasn't any investor who would take me seriously and say, this girl is wearing high heels, she's looking for 3 million to go and start an agricultural venture. So I knew I had to start by proving myself first, and that's why I had to drive around this beautiful province of Gauteng to try and find land. That took me about 3 months. I was knocking on people's farms to say, hi, my name is Vutlari. I saw you have greenhouse tunnels, can I rent? The one farmer who took me seriously actually first had to laugh in my face. He said, but you look like a pretty girl from Sandton. I'm like, it's because I am. He says, what? He says, what are you doing here? I say to him, I want to farm. He's like, come back next week, really do a PowerPoint presentation and convince me why I should give you a chance. And I had to go back and convince him, and basically that's how my journey started. The first question he asked me, so what do you want to grow? I'm like, spinach. He's like, okay, so clearly you are also going to need my help as a mentor. Because if you are going to make it in agriculture, you need to understand the resources that you have and how you can best make that to be profitable. So this farmer became my mentor as well, and that's how my journey started. So when we started, he said to me, if you're going to make money because you've got a small piece of land, you need to grow high value. I didn't even know what that was. He said, if you're going to start with high value crops, and we decided on herbs. I need to qualify culinary herbs. We do want to go into cannabis, but we don't have the finances as yet. It's still a long way to go. And we started with culinary herbs, and I was fortunate that in 2019, I entered a competition that was run by the SAB, AB and Bev, I know, the alcohol company. They were looking to fund young entrepreneurs to capacitate them to become commercial farmers. And we managed to be part of the top 10 participants in the country, and we were given funding to now start a hydroponic system. Now, part of the program, they said to us, is that, we don't just want to give you funding and walk away. We need to make sure that we can assist you with off-take agreements, because now you're going to start this high-tech, very expensive system. And we were actually forced to become, a global gap certified, which meaning that we needed to have food and health systems in our organization. The process was really painful and expensive. Because as a novice farmer, now I realized, okay, now I need to be mindful of, okay, how I store my chemicals, how I apply my fertilizers. And it was such a beautiful journey, but the end result was that the off-taker was going to be McDonald's. McDonald's was going to be taking our tomatoes, so we're going to be using them in their burgers. They also, got an off-take with Nando's. Nando's was going to use our tomatoes for their salads. But obviously, we started producing. I know I'm taking long with about it, but it will make the other slides go quicker. We started producing the tomatoes. This was just before the lockdown, the hard lockdown, level 5. And once our tomatoes were ready for harvesting, obviously, McDonald's said to us, you know what? We have a specification for our tomatoes. We only want the big, giant, makulu ones, the big ones. The small ones are too small for our burgers. So those ones, you can decide what you want to do with them. And I thought, my goodness. So the cost that I have been incurring as a farmer to produce this beautiful tomatoes, you are telling me that you're only going to take 20% of my production. The rest of the market was not interested in paying a very high price for these beautiful tomatoes, because there's another farmer who's growing them on the ground. They're just as nutritious. So why are they supposed to be paying a higher price for hydroponic tomato? And after this program ended with the urban agriculture, it just became unsustainable for us to be global certified, because first of all, it costs a lot of money. And now a lot of the customers that we were now targeting with the tomatoes were saying, no, you don't need global gap certification. And I thought, okay, so there isn't really an incentive to be implementing food and health systems, because everyone else just says, as long as the product looks good, we'll take it, because that way we'll be able to reduce the cost of procuring it from you. So it's been quite a journey, and now we have a hybrid production system. So what we have at our farm, we've got 10 greenhouse tunnels. There we are. Am I pointing here? Oh yeah, cool. So we've got 10 greenhouse tunnels where we grow our tomatoes hydroponically. And because the soil is still gold, if you're not going to produce hydroponically, you can still use the soil, you will still be able to make the right yields. So the spaces in between the tunnels, did I press something? Okay, there we go. So the spaces in between the tunnels, that is where we're growing the other vegetables in our production. And that's where we're growing our herbs. So what we've had to do is, this is one of my products, which is fancy lettuce. We grow it in between the tunnels. We've actually put shade net on top here to make sure that we create the right environment to create that product. For us, our hydroponic system, we're using the coco coir. The coir is imported from India. The experts told us that for us to continue using this type of system, we can only use a coir for about 3 or 4 production cycles. Thereafter, we need to change the soil and buy new soil. And to do this, my production alone, I would need about 300,000 just to replace the soil, without talking about fertilizer and everything else. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey. So what we've had to do in our organization, because tomatoes are a summer season crop, okay, I'll just continue. Can I continue? I think, okay, all right. So because tomatoes are a summer seasonal crop, in winter it's very difficult to grow tomatoes, I said to myself, okay, we need to make sure that we are profitable throughout the year, sustainability. So let's just incorporate the herbs. We also plant with tomatoes, and we will use the infrastructure that we have at the farm as our source of competitive advantage. So in summer, we grow tomatoes in the tunnels, and in winter, where it's difficult to grow the herbs outside because it's extremely cold, then we move the herbs inside the tunnels. And we focus on high-value crops, which have a very quick turnaround time. With my culinary herbs, if I plant today, in 2 weeks' time, I'm starting to harvest. And in terms of yields, okay, we'll continue. In terms of yields, if I plant, let's say, 15,000 of seedlings in one tunnel, I'm able to get about 700 kilos of rocket, which we can sell at about 70 rand a kilo. So once you start doing the math, the farmer realizes that actually there's a lot of money in agriculture. It just depends on how you position yourself. Oh, wow. So why agroecological practices? When I started leasing that farm I told you about, we had the beautiful tunnels, beautiful infrastructure, but what he forgot to mention was that there was a problem with the soil. The soil had root knot nematodes because they had been monocropping at this farm. And this is a reality for most of the farmers that come into the industry, where you find that someone says farm for sale. What they don't say is that we've been monocropping and there's a problem with the soil, that's why we're leaving, right? And because there was a problem with the soil, I almost gave up my agricultural journey 3 times because the financial side just was not making sense. And add on to that, 3 months into our production, we were hit by hail, not once, 2 times. Now I had to decide what day and then that, am I going to go back to my old boss and ask for my job back? Am I going to go and show up to this agricultural industry? And for me, I decided to show up in the agricultural space, but then I realized that it was important to look after the soil, because if you don't, then really you are doing yourself a disservice, because then your journey becomes short-lived. I will skip this part. I'm almost out of time. Fertile soils, they're very important for making sure that you have a long-term gain in the agricultural space. The other alternative is hydroponics. Hydroponics are very expensive to operate. I do not want to lie. In a country where we're struggling with energy crisis, with an economy which is not growing, the market is not willing to absorb the cost of producing foods expensively. So we need first out souls, because the other part is that these farms that we operate, they are people that are linked to our farms. We're not just operating for profits. There are so many people that are not able to get employment. We're able to absorb them in our farms. So our approach, I'm just going to run through this quickly. What we have done to incorporate agroecological practice in the organization, I will use Gleesman's approach. And just to go through these, it will go very quickly. We've now went back to say, okay, soil scientists, the people that manufacture chemicals, help us to understand what is the best and the most cost-effective way of growing tomato. How can I make sure that I can grow it in a way which does not harm the environment, but in a way that will also help me to reduce my costs? So what these experts have done, they've helped us with a fertilizer program, with chemical programs, to make sure that we can remain sustainable. Before the Russia and Ukraine war, I didn't know that some of the fertilizers come from Russia until my fertilizer bill went almost by 80%. And now I have to sit down and say, okay, then how was my grandmother growing food back in the day without these expensive fertilizers? And that meant I had to go and do my own research. And most of the times our research as farmers, the young ones, it's called YouTube, right? Because the other ones that are done by the researchers, it's a long article like this that you need to go through and try to understand and trying to implement. And sometimes that is just not the quickest way of trying to absorb a solution when you are having a crisis at the farm. So what we've actually started doing in our farm in terms of recycling, we've been posting. So the waste from our lettuce, from our herbs, we've now bought red arugula farms, which we are using to compost our waste from our vegetables, and we are brewing that into compost tea. We want to look after our soil in terms of aiding microbes in there. Input reduction, we are using chicken manure. What we're doing now when we're planting in the soil, this plastic mulching, making sure that we can retain as much moisture into our soils. What we're doing before we can plant, making sure that we can do our soil analysis, making sure that the fertilizer programs that we get, it's precision. We're not just putting fertilizers, we're only going to augment what the soil is not able to provide. Soil health, at the end of the production cycle, if we do not have major diseases, whatever that we did not produce, we do not spray harmful chemicals, we incorporate that back into the soil. The no-tillage is still not something that we're currently doing. We are doing minimal tillage because the other alternatives are still expensive for us to incorporate. Biodiversity, we've got 12 different crops which we are rotating within our farms, just to make sure that we're not damaging our soils. We're also procuring seeds that have some kind of a seed defense that's embedded in them. Some of these seeds, they'll tell you they can, work with Fusarium wilts, powdery mildew. We try to do that so that we don't have to spray dangerous chemicals and put that into the environment. But the reality is that it is very expensive. Last slide, it's agro-processing. What we realize is that as a farmer, you can produce food, but if you're not able to sell it, then your journey becomes short-lived, because at the end, it's about managing people, profit, and the planet. If you cannot have the profit part of things, you do not have means of running your day-to-day operations. So the agro-processing part is something that we started doing. We also realizing that when we sell our produce in bulk, the end seller, who is the supermarket, makes more money than we do. So we've had to start, packaging our products into little panettes. But also we're using our food systems solutions to market ourselves. We've got customers, for example, who are producing guacamole. Big other companies that are producing guacamole, they need coriander to produce guacamole. And what they had said to us is, you need to make sure that you have 0 MRL results. I didn't know what MRL results are until I had to take my food to the lab and make sure that I don't spray dangerous chemicals. So in short, it's not just about profits anymore. We need to look after the soil because the alternative is very, very expensive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As you would notice, we are very pro-female farmer. She probably got the most time of everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, another round for all the beautiful ladies. I have an instruction that I need to share with you. We will not now ask questions and have responses. We first going to enjoy the products of the farmer and the farm worker, and then we will join you. And before we start the next session, we'll get all the questions from the room as well as from our moderator. And remember, social media, remember your comments, your observations, please. On that note, please excuse us. We are going to enjoy the fruit of our labor. And we will be back at 2 o'clock.
Starting ourselves back for the final session of this day for us here. Just a reminder, please make sure that you're sharing your thoughts and messages on social media for World Food Day. So what we want to do for this last session is focus on our FSNet-Africa Fellows. So we've had a little bit of an introduction this morning from Julian about the FSNet-Africa model. And core to that model are our FSNet-Africa Fellows. So these are 20 fellows, early career, based in our 11 institutions across 6 countries, doing research on different aspects of the food system. And so they are really at the coalface. They're right in the front line in terms of trying to understand how we can go about transforming our food system to make sure that it's more sustainable and that it delivers fresh and nutritious food for everyone. So without further ado, we're going to move on to those presentations. And then what we're going to do is come at the end to consider all of the questions that we've had across all of the sessions today in one big discussion at the end. So if you've got questions for our previous speakers, don't worry, we will pick those up as we come to the discussion at the end of this session. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Salom to come up and give the first presentation in this session. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to present the research I'm doing with my at FSNet-Africa. I'm Salom Dovlo. My presentation is titled Transforming Food Systems with Agroecology, looking at possible pathways and interactions for integrating sustainable mechanization. My presentation will be, I'll try to introduce sustainable agricultural mechanization, look at the research I'm doing, and then look at some of the pathway and then the possible interactions. As an introduction, sustainable agricultural mechanization talks about application of tools, equipment, and machines in agricultural production process. And this we want to do in a manner that is socially, culturally, economically, and environmentally friendly. Now, when we talk about the production value chain, what we mean is from the production phase, the harvesting stage, the post-harvesting stage, storage, processing, packaging, and then transportation. All these stages involve elements of mechanization, and we want to incorporate sustainable mechanization into these stages, and that's what sustainable mechanization is about. And if this is achieved, the impact it will have is that you are able to have increased productivity from your land, and then also the impact of a shortage of labor will not be felt during your production. And if this is integrated well into conservation agriculture, you reduce the environmental footprint that agriculture have on the world, and that falls within the agroecology discussion we are having. And then, above all, we want to improve the livelihoods of people and achieve food security as well, and also reduce inequalities, where social, the income, and then employment inequalities. Now, with this, the current research we are doing, well, I also want to look at the stages in attaining full sustainable agricultural mechanization. And the first stage is power substitution, where we try to remove the drudgery in production. And this, as an example, you remove simple slashing of grass by the incorporation of handheld slasher that is being used in the picture here. And then the next stage is where you try to mechanize the human controls that you use in production. The next stage after that is trying to now adapt your cropping system to the machines that you have. And here, in terms of conservation agriculture, if you have no-till agriculture, for large-scale production, we have the crimper, which is being used for no-till agriculture. So you crimp the grass, and then you can now plant in there. And then we have this cultivator being used for production. And at the next stage of mechanization is where the farming system and the production environment is adapted to facilitate mechanization. So we have where you change gender norms, where you now do plant breeding to also allow you effectively mechanize your production and all. And then from there, we go to the full automation of the agricultural production system. And this is where we have the incorporation of sensors all over your farm, where you can just control your farm through a handheld device in your hand. So this is how full sustainable agricultural mechanization, the pathway is. With this in mind, our research is focusing on rice production in Ghana. And here, rice production is done mainly by smallholder farmers, which form major part of it. And constantly, there's been introduction of conservation agricultural practices in rice production. And for us to maintain these gains and also increase the productivity of the farmers, we have to ensure that they don't feel so much drudgery in their production. And this is why our research is trying to say that, okay, let's investigate the factors that influence the smallholder farmers' access and use of machinery within the scope of the food system. And by doing this, we can understand how they acquire machines and how they use it. Then we can propose methods of doing this effectively. And the project is going to focus on understanding the role of gender norms on machinery access, control, and ownership, trying to understand does the gender norms within the communities affect who has access to machines, who do you need to contact if you need to use machines, and what are the laid down principles for using machines. And then also, the study wants to understand the effect of machinery use on productivity as well as household income. As we heard from our farmer, income profitability is at the heart of farming. So if you can link machinery use to how profitable the farm is, then you can make a case for more use of this machinery. Our research seeks to come up with the following outcomes. We'll develop a framework that will support machinery provision and utilization by smallholder farmers. And this is targeted towards conservation agricultural practice. Then we will also provide policy directions that will help in effective conservation agricultural mechanization in Ghana, and then also provide policy directions for gender transformative agricultural machinery ownership. Now, with all this, the overall impact of the research will be to improve livelihoods and achieve food security while reducing inequalities. And this place, when we are looking at the 5 levels of agroecology, this place at the global change level where we want to see global change in that. And then the possible, looking at the pathways to achieving that through what our research is doing. With our framework, we will impact levels 1 and 2 where there is the need to improve the sustainable inputs into agriculture. So by developing a framework that allows farmers to get machines, will help achieve this. And then the policy directions will help in redesigning the agro-ecosystem as well. And then with our gender transformative policy guidelines, that will help within the social dimensions aspects of the levels of achieving agroecology. Now, this pathway, there must be some interactions that will help to achieve this. And we have at the top of that our smallholder farmer. And the smallholder farmer needs access to machine, which will be provided by machinery or equipment manufacturers and importers. They import and manufacture the machine and put them within equipment exchange or in the market for the smallholder farmers to have access to. But the other important interaction is the research and development experts who are there to look at what are the smallholder farmers doing, what do they need, and then communicate with the equipment manufacturers and importers to have continuous update of machinery within the machinery exchange. And they provide standards and policy guidelines. And the other thing is the objectives or the aims of these interactions for the smallholder farmer is to ensure equality and food security. For the equipment exchange is to ensure that we have scale-appropriate equipment within the equipment exchange for them to have access to. And then for the equipment manufacturers and importers, it's about sustainable manufacturing for them to ensure they also have access. And then for the research experts and development experts, it's about providing policy and regulation to ensure that these interactions are done in a way that will support the main objective of equality and food security for the smallholder farmer. In conclusion, sustainable mechanization integration into agroecology is needed because the gains have to be sustained, and also the farmers, all the drudgery in their production must be removed through effective sustainable agricultural mechanization. Also, using the Greenson's level of transformation of the food systems, I would say sustainable mechanization intervention activities targeted at levels 1 to 3 should be informed by aspirations from level 4 and 5. And then also, global change can be promoted through adequate incentives and interactions between stakeholders. If we're able to incentivize these changes we want to see and improve the interactions, we can actually effectively incorporate sustainable agricultural mechanization into agroecology and reap all the benefits. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Salom, and right on time as well. Excellent. So I think that kind of gives us a really good starting point to start thinking about the way in which we can think about different interventions in terms of how they link into agroecology. So our next speaker is Antoinette. So she's now going to tell us about her research plans. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Antoinette Simpai Jr. from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And this afternoon I'll be talking to you about my research, which is fruit byproducts as feed, an agroecological approach to small ruminants nutrition. So livestock play an important role in our food systems. They provide us with high quality protein and other essential micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals. They also provide us with incomes, assets, and a source of livelihoods. Despite these benefits, livestock have been ignored in our agro-systems thinking, although they are dependent on a lot of natural processes. Instead, anytime we think about biodiversity loss, when we talk about pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, when we talk about increasing land demand and changes in land use, we talk about livestock farming. As Glesman highlighted, the problem does not lie with the animals themselves or in their use as food, but the ways in which they are incorporated into our agroecosystem and our food systems. And therefore, their disconnectedness from the agroecosystem may probably be the problem why there's lack of sustainability of the livestock farming systems. The situation as proposed by Glesman is what pertains in Ghana, particularly in the northern part of the country where our small ruminants are produced. Sadly, northern Ghana is mostly hit by climate change, and so the area is characterized by high temperatures, erratic rainfall patterns, and long dry periods. And all of these have negative consequences on our livestock productivity, especially with respect to the availability of feed during the year. Our preliminary investigation shows that and the exploitation of alternative feed resources, as well as non-existence of preservation technologies, all contributes to this problem of feed scarcity, which is more pronounced during the dry season. It is, however, established that we can use livestock to increase the African food system efficiency, as well as create a circular agro-food system. And therefore, investigations that address these existing gaps will go a long way in meeting our demand for animal source foods as we strive to feed our growing population. It is against this backdrop that our project seeks to explore agroecological practices to improve livestock production among smallholder farmers in rural Ghana. Now, to extend agroecological thinking into animal production, we've highlighted 6 out of the 13 agroecological principles by the HLPE. And 5 of them, according to Glissman's framework, are incremental in levels 1 and 2. And these are recycling, that is plowing back into the food chain, reducing inputs needed for production, adopting management practices that aims at improving animal health, enhancing biodiversity within the animal production systems to increase their resilience, and then encouraging interactions or synergies between the different elements in the agroecosystem. Now, the 6th one is co-creation of knowledge, which is transformational in our food system. Now, the present study directly employs 3 of these agroecological principles, and they are input reduction, recycling, and co-creation of knowledge. To a larger extent, we have animal health, which is also contributing to our project. One way of maximizing our agroecological principles of input reduction and recycling in our food systems is feeding animals. It is therefore not surprising that feeding animals ranks 3rd on the food recovery hierarchy as proposed by the FAO. So in our approach of recycling and input reduction is using fruit byproducts as an alternative feed resources to sustainably enhance small ruminants' nutrition and meat quality. So these are fruit byproducts, and from the picture, they are highly perishable products. However, they contain valuable sources of nutrients and phytochemicals. And so as part of the study, we'll first investigate these nutrients and phytochemicals, as well as assess their suitability to be used as feed. Now, due to the perishable nature of our byproducts, we'll further go on to ensal our byproducts and then feed them to small ruminants in feeding trials and assess their impact on animal performance and the quality of meat. Now, we anticipate that when we are done with our study, we will have data on the nutritional and phytochemical composition of our studied fruit byproduct. We'll also have data on the effect of feeding these valorized fruit byproducts on small ruminants' performance and meat quality. And as part of our co-creation activities, farmers will be trained in how to use the ensiling technology post-project implementation to ensure continuity of our research intervention. In the long term, we foresee a reduction in biomass and the burdens on the environment due to the valorization of our fruit byproducts, which would have otherwise ended up in our landfills. We also see, or we envisage, an improvement in our food and nutrition security, as well as improved livelihoods of our livestock farmers in Ghana and in Africa at large. Thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. Another person who is keeping well to time. I think we all have something to learn from our early career researchers. And And I think it brings in a really important element of when we're thinking about agroecology, which we don't often think about, and that is livestock. I think oftentimes our focus is on crops, and we don't think enough about how livestock fits into these systems. So that's really good that we've got that and we're considering that. So last but not least, I'd like to introduce Bridget up for her talk on her research.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Bridget, and I'm Zambian. I don't know what you know about being Zambian, but it also means that we're obsessed with eating nshima, made from maize. So if you visit me and I serve you rice or potatoes or whatever, the message I'm sending you is that you're not welcome. If you're really welcome, then I give you nshima and ideally chicken. Yeah, so when we're happy, we eat nshima. When we're sad, we have a bereavement, we eat nshima. When your child has done well at school, we give you nshima. It's always nshima. So that means that we're always growing maize. And that is good, and it is also bad. So I want to talk to you today about climate resilient and sustainable agricultural intensification in eastern Zambia, and focus on a pathway towards agroecological transition. So what is the problem? So of course, most of our farmers are smallholders. That just means that they're both producers and consumers. So they grow the maize, they sell it, and then they eat it. So that brings interesting problems, because as farmers, they want to grow maize, they want to have high yields, and then they want to sell it. But then when they go to buy, they want to buy it very cheaply. So this has forced the government to give a subsidy where they give farmers hybrid maize seed and mineral fertilizer. And this has been going on since our independence in 1964. So our farmers are very much used to getting this fertilizer and maize every year on an annual basis, just like that. So what they've done, what they normally do is grow a lot of maize, add mineral fertilizer, and then nothing else. There's no bothering with general soil health or anything else. It's always about maize and mineral fertilizers. And because of that, then they get very low yields. I give an example here. You see there. Where is the pointer? Yes. So the national average is about 2.2 tons per hectare. And this is hybrid maize seeds. And potentially they could get up to 12 or 14 tons, but they only get 2. And this is because they're not doing anything other than just adding the mineral fertilizer. And it's even worse when they don't use it. So if they don't use it, then it's like 1. But even when they do use it, then it's 2. But because it's subsidized and coming from the government, then they keep using it and then just making things worse. So what essentially happens is that they keep getting the low yields, and if they want to increase the number of bags of maize, then they have to cultivate a larger area. So you find that also we're lucky, we're quite a low population density country, so we do have land where farmers are able to expand. So if a farmer wants to move from 15 bags to 30 bags, then they cultivate more land, and that means that they're cutting down trees and resulting in a lot of deforestation and everything else that results from that. And then because all they are doing is now spreading the little fertilizer they have over a larger area, they still retain the low yields, and hence the problem persists. So what I'm interested in looking at is what attempts have been made to deal with this. So there have been a lot of funding to try and promote climate resilient and sustainable agricultural intensification. So some of it focuses on tillage practices. So for instance here, this is for like very poor farmers that do not have access to oxen. Then they make these using just a traditional hand hoe. And the idea is they focus the nutrients in the basins. So this is where you put the seed, this is where you put the lime, the mineral fertilizer, and also the organic fertilizer if you have it. And then if you have sort of oxen, then they make these drip lines, and then they put all the inputs here. And then in between here, this is where they put the sort of the organic matter when they do have it. So the idea here is to increase the nutrient use efficiency, because everything is just here or in the basins, and nothing is wasted. And then you combine this with other practices, other agronomic practices. So there's a lot of crop residues that are put in between here. So the idea is when they decompose, then the nutrients go back into the soil, and it should work like that. But then also mixing with legumes, so that instead of using too much mineral fertilizer, they can supplement this with the legumes. So if this works, then it should mitigate the extensification, because now there's no motivation for them to keep extending, but they get more yield in a smaller area. So what I really want to study is how well is this happening? Is it possible to increase agricultural productivity in an equitable manner that is taking into consideration all the different kinds of smallholder farmers that are there? Because there are men, there are women, there are boys and girls, they're rich, they're poor. So can they increase their agricultural productivity, taking into consideration the changing climate and also without having a negative impact on the environment? So some of the key research questions we ask are really, what are the factors that are important in terms of social, cultural, and political economy, and of course policy. And then in the context of the changing climate, what are the opportunities for really applying those agroecological principles and improving productivity without really having to depend so much on the fertilizer subsidies. So my study area is Eastern Zambia. I started doing some of this research about 5 years ago. So in the red there, this is where I've already sort of done some work there. So I'm hoping now on this project to focus on the green areas here. So the difference is not just in terms of geography, but there are different tribes, different practices, different kinds of access to livestock and things like that. So just to see if this makes a difference. And then using a method of bringing farmers together and then sort of co-production of knowledge. We bring different groups together and then ask them to discuss sort of what kind of problems do they have. And the emphasis is on learning from each other. So for instance, I bring farmer A, what do you think are the main problems in practicing climate smart agriculture? And then they'll do some ranking, they'll share their problems, and then they'll learn from each other. At the end of the day, it should be like the knowledge is coming from them, and then also they propose the solution. Also, I'll do a survey, and it's not yet set in how many districts, but ideally about 400 households. And of course, it will be a gender-responsive study, because I believe that the outcomes are quite gendered. It matters if you're a woman, if you're a young woman, you're a rich woman, if you're a farmer in hills, or you're an old woman, you know, all those kind of things. So we want to see really what kind of differences does this make. So the intervention should really speak to the different kinds of farmers that are there. And of course, this is just briefly about how we do the social learning lab. I've published about this. If you're interested, then you can check out some of my publications which really explain how this is done. And then we're also very big on the stakeholder engagement. So of course, our key stakeholders are, sorry, I can't see that far. Is that 10 minutes left? 1 minute? Okay, yeah, let me just finish up. Yeah, so we're very, very big on the stakeholder engagement. So of course, we're dealing with the key stakeholders who are the farmers and the input suppliers and the extension workers, the NGOs, the researchers, but also the donors, because we believe that the way this sort of smallholder agriculture is really influenced by development partners, because they determine sort of how climate smart agriculture is practiced. So if it's NORAD funding, then they would say this is how we want it done. If it is DFID, just like that. So that has a big impact. So we're interested in engaging with them in how can we do this better. And also with the policymakers. As I've said, climate change policy and agri policy has proved to be very important. So I'll just quickly run through that. In terms of impact, the idea is, yes, we'll get the publication, but we're also really big on the policy engagement, and then going back to the farmers to really talk to them about what came out of the research that we're doing. And yeah, those are my references, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And keeps the team score up high there by making it in the time that you had. So well done, great. But I think also really important that this kind of brings in these ideas around knowledge and farmer knowledge, and learning from farmer knowledge, and farmers learning from each other too, which I think is really important. Okay, so I think that kind of brings us to a point where we can start opening up to questions. So questions for our speakers from this session, but also beyond that, questions for our other panelists from previous sessions as well. So anybody would like to start us off with some questions, maybe for our FSNet fellows first? Anybody want to come in? Do we have any online? Do you want to bring those in?
So we have several questions from online for different speakers. So how many do you want me to take, Claire?
Well, yeah, let's just start running through them then, and then I'm sure if there are people in the room that want to kind of come in, then they can do. But yeah, let's start with those questions.
All right. So for Alice, what do you think of dialogic education? I believe a truly dialogic learning or knowledge generation process is really important to develop, including linking to praxis, practice, and reflection rooted in the real-world situations. For Anne, does your work apply social network analysis for food systems analysis and understanding? I hope Anne is still with us online. For Prof. Pell again, how are we going to change the youth view on agriculture production from being punishment or work for the poor?
Maybe we'll take responses to those. Maybe if we do like 3 at a time, and then we can kind of take some responses and see. So maybe Prof. Pell, you want to start first? Do you want to?
The dialogic education question, as I understand it, means the incorporation of sort of a conceptual framework that involves both theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge and having impact in the field. I think that the models that I'm proposing include that. I probably talked a lot about problem solving, and that's, I think, the point at which you become acquainted with the field and the theoretical part of it, as well as the practical applications. You've got to keep both in mind. So I think I agree with it. I use different terminology. And I think it's very important that people know what's happening in their field. And what happened in their field, I was talking at lunch with Lisa, what was happening in their field a while ago, because some very, very good work was done in those periods about how crops grow and things like that. In terms of the how to make agriculture more appealing, I think that we got the answer in our vegetable farm talk today. No, I think it's partly selling it. I want to buy her vegetables, and it was a compelling story. If I go to a farmer's market and I see rotten tomatoes and things like that, the work, I have run a farm. I do know how much work it is. I think there are some real benefits to farm life that it's not going to appeal to everybody. It will work differently than it did in our parents' or grandparents' generations, and we need to accommodate that. But the business model, she is not using the business model that if her grandmother had been a farmer would have been using. So it's just a different world, and I think it's part of the agricultural community's responsibility to make it look like fun and to come up with good products, because that's where you make the money. You can't sell subpar products and survive.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I don't know, do we have Anne online still? Who can respond to her question? There she is. Hello, Anne, how are you? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh.
Mute, unmute. Sorry, you have to have one, don't you? I've got a very short answer. It's no. I haven't used social network analysis, certainly not the formal quantitative models. I've been very much a qualitative researcher. The person who asked me that question has already contacted me via a network, via LinkedIn, and I will be happy to have a conversation with him about how we might do this in the future. But I suppose so the short answer was no. The longer answer is, why would we want to use social network analysis? What's the question? What's the problem? Going back to the sorts of things that Alice was asking. So I think we need to think about the problem and the questions that we're asking first, and then we get into the methods. But I'm very happy to have methodological conversations. I think you've done it before, haven't you, Claire?
Actually, yes, I have. Working in mangroves in Vietnam, we use social network analysis.
So maybe when you're back home, we'll have a chat as well.
but given how important networks are to what we do, and the fact that we're FSNet, which is all about networks, it's really great that today we're already getting those connections and people making connections outside of the discussions or leading on from the discussions that are happening today. So that's really good to know, and we would encourage everybody who's either here in person or online to do that and reach out and connect with the people that you're hearing and seeing in these sessions today. So do we have any more questions that we want to go on to next? Maybe we'll take 3 more and we'll see where we get to.
So we have a question from Kenya, and it's, I guess anybody could take it from probably the second panel, the first panel, so the mentors panel. In Kenya, we have a big debate regarding introduction of GMOs as a solution to the perennial problem of food and nutrition insecurity. Do we consider GMOs a plus or minus to sustainable and sound agroecological systems? The next question, also probably more general, how can we limit environmental impacts in rural communal areas with diverse land use systems? And then the next one I think would be most appropriate for Lisa because she spoke to food sovereignty. Food sovereignty should be the credo over security. What is the rationale that the term security is still associated with agroecology?
Great. So, Stella, I was thinking maybe you would want to tackle that first question.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's a lot of debate on GMOs. And of course, GMOs have some positives, but they have also a lot of negative impacts. So we have to think about, whether we really need GMO to solve the problems that we have, problems related to food security and also reducing environmental impacts. And where I sit, I think that GMO are not a solution, that we can use other seed varieties to produce food, because GMOs, then it means that farmers have to buy their seeds every other season, and it's very expensive, especially for smallholders. We can use GMO in commercial farms that are producing crops for industry. But for food crops, I think there are many alternatives. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stella. So, was there anybody in particular wanted to tackle that second question? Maybe remind us what that second question was. It's already gone out of my head.
So it was, how can we limit environmental impacts in rural communal areas with diverse land use systems?
Oh. That's a tough one. Anybody want to tackle that question? We have a brave soul who's gonna gonna take that on.
So I think if the question is asked around environmental degradation and agricultural use or land use, I think the first one is land tenure. Because if your land tenure, and that's actually a policy, whether it's at a national level or a local level, your land tenure needs to support the diversity of your landscape, first thing. But the second one is actually about the indigenous knowledge that you have. Because if you argue you want to have land used differently, well, what does the market say? Or what does the next village say? Are you going to eat it? Do you know how to prepare it? So it's all those questions within a broader context of land tenure. Because if you don't have that sorted, and I'm not meaning ownership, it's actually understanding how it works. You can't introduce new things. Because for who are you introducing it? Because it has to be for the people there, either to make money or to have food security. So any introduction will have to look at the cultural and the social, both networks, as well as the practices. And only then can you look at it and say, what do we do to reduce environmental degradation? But you have to start at the community and village level.
Great. That's a perfect answer, I think, to that one. So, Lisa, over to you.
Sure, that was a very complicated question, loaded and very political. And we've published some papers in both agroecology and food sovereignty, and obviously food security. I think it's a lot to do with the social discourse and what's popular at the time. I think if we look at the big funding bodies and the NGOs and just the current debate, where the money is going, when we create these centers of excellence, a lot of funding was going into food security, for instance. So that was a key theme and a key driver at the time. And I think we've forgotten about the responsibility, both from an individual and a governance level, to ensure that we have food and the right to food. So I think it's become more important, the right to food and the responsibility of a government to ensure that there is adequate food. And I think it's the war that's reminded us of World War I and II, when we were all food insecure. There wasn't enough food, and we thought of different ways of preserving food. We've now moved into fresh produce, and it's very popular, but the first thing we saw during the disruptions during COVID and Ukrainian war was that we couldn't move the fresh produce, so it all went to waste. So perhaps it's time to also stand back and think of moving back to how do we preserve the food, not only lengthen the shelf life, but have alternative options. But we must still, it is our responsibility to ensure there's food for all. So I'm not sure if I've addressed that question effectively.
But I think it does raise an important issue around the kind of resilience of our food systems. I think one of the things that was very apparent in the UK when we started to see the effects of the COVID pandemic was our just-in-time way of supplying lots of things, including food. And so we don't have a huge storage capability or capacity anymore. And that works very well in a globalized system as long as everything else is working very well. But as soon as you get a shock to that system falls down. So it's very sensitive to changes. And so I think what the pandemic has made us realise, or I hope it's made us realise, is that idea of how resilient is our system, and to make sure that we think about those issues of resilience. So, do we have time, I think, for a few more questions? Yeah?
On that preservation of food question, it's also true that many frozen foods actually have a higher nutritional value than the fresh produce that's been sitting around in the supermarket for a week. And the frozen produce is harvested and it's processed and it's frozen within hours. And it actually is, in many cases, more nutritious, which is counterintuitive, but correct.
That is if you have enough energy and not load shedding.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're just going to do the last few questions before we wrap up on this session and on the day. So, Liz, over to you for the last questions.
So for Salom, how do we develop local manufacture of equipment? For Antoinette, how does the collection, storage, and distribution of fruit waste work in the real world without attracting vermin? And who is collecting and managing the waste, and what costs are involved with this source of feed? So that's 3 in 1. Bridget, my Zambian sister, why are the subsidies not going towards the soil organic fertility inputs in agroecology and self-production by farmers, to farmers, with farmers?
Some good questions there. So, Salom, would you like to kick off?
Okay, thank you for the question. In terms of how we develop local manufacture of equipment, the major problems with local manufacture is actually about there's a problem with production where the equipment needed to produce the machines are not there. The grade of metal and parts that are needed are also not available. So those problems have to be solved, and some of the ways are through incentives and tax rebates on importation of those materials into the country. There are problems with the tax rebate where those metals or products needed for the production have to be targeted directly at manufacturing, and there are other uses. So it becomes a problem of how are we sure that this ends up with producing equipment for locals, and the innovative solutions have to be brought up on how to improve that, and that's one way. And the other problem is creating demand locally. There should be local demand for the equipment, and this will be brought through, example, the projects we are doing where the farmer is understood, and then also how they want their machines are incorporated into training sessions for the local farmers and the manufacturers, and then that creates some demand over there for them. And then also the overarching thing would be to create incentives that would enhance or promote the use of local manufactured equipment with the farmers. And that could be done by government institutions and the donor agencies within the local frames, and that would help improve local manufacture of machinery.
Great.
Thank you,
Salom. Good answer. And I think that raises the question that I think Julian has earlier about why we keep institutions, but all of those structures are really important. Antoinette, you next for your question.
Yes, I was lucky
Yes. I will come to you, so don't worry, I have seen you.
So I was lucky to have 3 in 1. So the first question about how waste collection happens in the real world is virtually non-existent now. And that is why we are driving this change of collecting our waste. So currently, and I'm using Ghana as our example, most of our waste generated ends up in our landfill. Nobody's collecting them, nobody's doing any work on them. And we are trying to push this agenda of collecting the waste, probably involving a lot of our feed processing companies to see the importance of this waste. so that it doesn't end up in our landfills to pollute our environment, but rather is channeled back into the food chain as a way of feeding it to our animals. So for now, it is almost non-existent, but we are trying to push that agenda. And who is collecting them? If it doesn't exist, nobody's collecting it. So it's going into our landfills. The best we are trying to do as part of my FSNet project is to engage stakeholders, especially in the feed processing industry, open the idea of collecting this waste, analyzing them, exposing the value of the waste to them and what it can be channeled into. So in our case, animal feed. Feed is a problem. Whether it is ruminants, whether it's poultry, whether it's pigs, is a problem. It accounts for almost 70% of our cost of production. And so finding alternative ways of bringing down the cost of production is the way to go for us. How much does it cost? For now, it's free. Until we find the value of it, it is free. We collect them, we can collect as many as we can. But once we do the research and we are able to discover the valuable nutrients in it, it is not free anymore. Now people start attaching value to it and then they start selling it to our farmers. And so we are at that complexity of it's free now. When we get to know it, does it become free anymore? No. And then we have to find another solution. Thank you.
Great. So what we're going to do, I'll do Bridget, but then we'll give the final words in this discussion session to our farmer. But Bridget, if you want to respond to your question first.
And my possibly politically incorrect response is that there's too much vested interest in the status quo for it to change. Because right now, what happens is like there are a lot of tenders to supply the seed and the fertilizer, and they're very lucrative contracts. So a few years ago, we tried to change where instead of having just the fertilizer and the seed, you actually just give farmers a voucher, and then they could go to any agro dealer and get whatever they wanted. So they could get equipment, they could get legumes or whatever. It didn't work very well. It was almost like sabotage from the beginning. And also what we did find was that there are a lot of ghost farmers. So in one district, I think it was up to 15,000. So now you know that, you know, there's Bridget, Walia, Bridget, what, just the same name 5 times. So where are those inputs going? So definitely, and we've made those recommendations that we should change this, make it open so that a farmer could get whatever they want as part of the subsidy and not this. But it hasn't worked. So it's an ongoing debate. Yeah, thank you.
And it's not just for Zambia, but I was in Malawi a couple of days ago, and it's exactly the same conversation where the subsidies are all about maize.
Yeah.
But actually, if we want diversification in the agricultural system, then we need to move beyond that. But it's very political.
Yeah.
Some comments from the farmer in the room to wrap this part of our session up.
I'm really excited about the questions, because all the questions that were posed to the researchers, those are the experiences that we are having on the ground as farmers. The first one being mechanization. If you're a small-scale farmer, the big tractor, the John Deere ones that you see on the adverts, those are very difficult, high capital assets to acquire. So for a small farmer, you start thinking, okay, if I cannot afford that mechanization, that what you are using my farm, then you go back to the normal hoe. That increases your labor. It's not, sometimes it's not very effective because, land preparation, you plant, your yield doesn't come out very well because the land preparation was not done well. And also sometimes, I've also imported some of this mechanization from, the ones that manufacture mechanizations. But when they import them into the country, it's not fit for purpose. My terrain that I'm working on and that machine, it's not strong enough to deal with my problems at my farm. Now the cost of having to replace those parts is a problem. The people that are available to help me with the support and the maintenance of that mechanization becomes another problem. So now I'm sitting with this asset at my farm. I've only used it for 2 months and there's nothing else I can do. It was supposed to help me with my problem, but now it's become another headache. I can't use it, I can't service it, and now it's just standing there because, I made a wrong call by buying a machine from someone who said it would work, but now it's not working. So the challenge about mechanization is really spurred on, especially the ones which farmers can afford. if an individual farmer cannot afford, as black farmers, we are aware of the Stokvel model. Please explain to your neighbor what's a Stokvel. Where you come together as farmers and you say, you know what, this machine costs 500,000 here in a local community. We can club together and buy this machine and we'll use it all together, all of us. That's what we started doing as farmers, because now we realize that we're on our own. The funding for some of this capital assets is not coming fast enough. That's what we started doing in terms of fertilizers, in terms of seeds, because we realized that in order for us to afford some of this, more expensive inputs like seeds, we need to start, coming together as farmers. The issue on waste. At my farm, we have a lot of waste. And you say to the pig farmer, please come and collect. And he says, no, I don't have transport. I'll come next week. And then next week, he says, no, I had a breakdown. I'll come the other week. By the time he comes, that waste has decomposed in my farm. Now I've created another bigger problem in my farm, because now I've got thrips that are taking whatever pathogens they're taking from that waste. They're depositing it to my tomatoes. Now I've got a bigger problem. So now the collection of waste becomes a challenge, because it's also a cost to some of the farmers who might not afford to have the right means to come and collect. So now when farmers say, no, I'll come and collect waste from my farm, I'll just go, okay, it's fine. But I'll have another way of trying to get rid of it, because it will take long and then it becomes a problem for me. The last point for Bridget about inputs, we are living with it on a daily basis, where someone has decided on a tender. They've come and dumped this fertilizer in my farm. I don't know what to do with it because I don't use it. But because someone has received a tender to supply potassium sulfate, I don't need it for my fertilizer. But they tell you, no. That's what we're procuring for all the farmers. Why are we treating the same farmers with the same blanket approach? So from a policy perspective, from a procurement perspective, I almost feel like sometimes we need to go back and have conversations with farmers and say, what challenges are you experiencing on a daily basis? For me, my biggest problem with growing tomatoes is tuta absoluta. What research has been done on tuta, apart from, the normal pesticides that are available out there? I know maybe it's a recent problem, but what research is being done to help farmers deal with those kind of problems? So, tuta is one of the most dangerous pests. Just Google tuta, you'll hear all the farmers go, ah. That's the one that stands between a tomato farmer and profit. And yeah. We have a lot of pest pressures in our farms, a lot of challenges. Come and talk to us and say, what should we be researching on?
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. So I think that was a really great session, and I think there were some really fabulous questions. Apologies if we didn't get to your question, but we will make sure that those questions get to the people that you are asking, so that we can kind of continue those conversations. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Mel, who's going to wrap everything up from today's session. So Mel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you to everybody who has joined the conversation today. I think the point you just ended on, Voltori, we're not talking. It's a nice opportunity. We don't often have the luxury of the time to sit down together and talk. And some of us have been in person here today to talk, but we've also been talking to you online and through the chat. And so I really want to thank everybody who took the time to join our conversation. If you don't know by now, you've missed the headline message. Our theme for today was finding pathways to agroecological transitions in Africa. And so we've looked at this topic from many, many different angles. And we looked at what is agroecology. We've talked about it as a science, we've talked about it as a practice, and we've talked about it as a movement. We've come together in this space today from different countries, we come from different disciplines, we come from different sectors, but we have a common vision, and that is to end hunger. But to do so in a way that livelihoods are protected, and to do so in a way that the planet is protected. So Julian started off our conversation today highlighting that there really are many misconceptions around what agroecology is. And so one of our objectives today was to open up this space and to talk about what it means to us from our lens, from our projects, from our businesses and perspectives. Prof. May elucidated in his presentation the incremental aspects of change, but also those transformational aspects of change, and introduced some of the key themes today, which really is those 13 principles of agroecology. In her keynote address, Prof. Powell reminded us that we have some big problems to solve in the food system: malnutrition, climate change, poverty, inequality. And I borrow her own words when she said, we can't run the planet this way. We need to figure out how we're going to tackle these problems, and we need to figure it out quickly, because actually we've run out of time. During our 2 panel sessions today, we started to reflect on whether diverse ecological production techniques and integrating these at the farm level, at the landscape level, can this provide opportunities for agroecological transitions that are sustainable, but that are also financially viable. Whilst reflecting on the past and where we are today, we had our inputs from the 4 beautiful ladies. Anne from the University of Leeds spoke on this issue of supply chains and how can supply chains be sustainable. Some of the principles that she touched on, the agroecological principles, were fairness, connectivity, co-creation, and participation. Her key message is we need to move away from working on supply chains to working with key actors in the supply chains. Stella, one of our FSNet-Africa mentors from the University of Nairobi, highlighted many examples of where agroecology is already being practiced and linked to several of the agroecological principles, including soil health, fairness, participation, synergy, and importantly, the social values and cultural components of diet and food. Lisa, also one of our African mentors from the University of Pretoria, actually really shared some great insights on where does agroecology come from, what is the historical background, and really what are the trends that we are seeing take place currently. She highlighted the important linkages between food safety, sovereignty, agroecology, and all of this within the policy space. From the farmer perspective, Voltari shared her journey as a female entrepreneur in the food system. Her story, the challenges and the successes, have inspired us today to think about agroecology through the eyes of a farmer. She has illustrated how the principles of input reduction, soil health, recycling, economic diversification, and co-creation of knowledge have been practically implemented in her business on a day-to-day basis. We then moved on to our FSNet-Africa Fellows, who were just in time and right on time in their presentations, focusing on where are we going in the future. Salom talked to us about his FSNet-Africa project, which is focusing on sustainable agricultural mechanization in rice production in Ghana. He too was able to make the linkages with the principles of agroecology, including economic diversification, social values and gender norms in the food system, fairness and participation. He is focusing on practical strategies that farmers can adopt to be more efficient, But at the same time, he reminded us to have that big picture lens whenever we want to implement our interventions. Antoinette shared her research, which is focusing on livestock to increase African food system efficiency and the establishment of a circular agro-food system. She also links her work to the principles of agroecology, focusing also on input reduction, but importantly, she brought our attention and focus to the principle of recycling and animal health, and again highlighting the idea of co-creation of knowledge. Bridget spoke to the challenges in the Zambian food system. And next time I am visiting in Zambia, I will certainly know how to tell if I'm really welcome or not. The agroecology principles she highlighted included soil health, participation, fairness, economic diversification, and again, I'm sure you can see the theme emerging, the idea of co-creation of knowledge. So there's a couple of focus areas that have stood out to me throughout the conversations that we've had today. They're a focus on systems, a focus on education, and a focus on partnerships, where really for me, this principle of co-creation is tied into and just deeply, deeply embedded if we want to run this planet a little bit better, in the words of Professor Powell. So just a few key comments on each of those themes. Focus on systems. We've been talking today about the food system, and I'm probably preaching to the converted because we've moved away from thinking we need to make food for someone to eat it. We understand there's this massive complexity that is embedded within the system. We know what the challenges are, and I think we're also at this point aware that the solutions we come up with, the way we look at our data, has to increase in its sophistication if we really want to get to the bottom of this. If we want to untangle the proverbial spaghetti and understand the problem, we've got to up our game. Upping our game also means upping our focus on education. And I really want to thank Professor Powell for the way that she made this very important link in her keynote address today. It's not only what we teach, but it's about the way that we teach. And it's also about the spaces that we're using to teach. Because we can't sit with a bunch of solutions in the research space, but those solutions aren't embedded in our extension systems. And those solutions are not informed by the challenges of the farmers on the ground. And really it becomes a system of its own, of how we understand our problems, address them, and then educate as widely as we can, and on less than 2 pages in less than 5 minutes, on how to do things better. And then on the issue of partnerships, I think Emmanuel has highlighted one of the most important points around partnerships, and that is that we've moved beyond just having partnerships to doing them in a way that is equitable and doing them in a way that is sustainable. And unpacking this question of what is an equitable partnership. I wish we had more time to explore in that, but let's just say at least we want to build our relationships on trust and respect, and we want to move forward in a way where there's mutual benefit for those that are in the partnerships. We want to go far, and so we're choosing to go together. We've already seen the value and the benefit that can come from working together in mutually beneficial ways. But the path is still long, and it's not an easy path. It will take patience, and it will take persistence. So each of us, wherever we find ourselves in the food system, has a path a part to play on the path. Some of us work in the science space, some of us work as farmers, others with us today are in the policy space. Every voice, every contribution is needed if we truly want to co-create. And regardless of the other roles we play in the food system, each and every one of us is a consumer of food. And we can make a conscious contribution to transforming the food system, even if it is incrementally, in the way that we choose to live our lives. So before I conclude today, I would really like to say a very special word of thanks to the team at FSNet-Africa who made it possible for us to sit around the table. Prof. Julian May had to leave for the airport already, but he was instrumental in helping us conceptualize this idea of putting this concept of agroecology on the table. And then to Carletta, who's been leading the team, who made it work, along with Esley, Rose, and Zetu, who have just masterfully coordinated this event. Thank you for everything that you've put in. Proudly, Team FSNet-Africa today. And then, of course, to everybody else on the team, and our broader team of people that we pull together and seek advice from. Thank you for your comments, your inputs, but importantly also your support. We have a big vision at FSNet-Africa, and we thank you for working with us and for joining hands with us. So I will conclude with a challenge today to say, let us imagine our world without hunger and a planet that is healthy. And let us go and make it happen. Thank you very much. And with that, I believe I officially conclude the event. Thank you for your participation.